I'm going to be talking to Professor Monica Gattinger of the University of Ottawa about a really important paper that she's written entitled Energy Security and the Road to Net Zero by 2050. And it's all about the question of whether Canada is ready for this switch from fossil fuels, which in Canada means mainly oil and gas, to electricity. So we're going to talk to her about that. And welcome to the interview, Monica.
Thank you for having me, Markham.
Well, why don't we start with an overview of your paper, please?
Yeah, no, sure, I'd be happy to. So listen, this was a paper I wrote for the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. They've got an energy security series, and the hook for it, as it were, was the power outage in Texas. And I think, I'm an energy geek, Markham. I've been following energy issues for decades now. And that's one of the things that's really struck me is that in, our zest for climate change action, we're focusing a lot on sources of energy to the intro that you gave. We're not necessarily focusing a lot on the availability and reliability of energy, nor necessarily on the price of energy. So I really wrote this piece to get at what are some of the key issues coming down the pike for Canada in the years ahead when it comes to energy security.
Well, let's talk about a few of those those issues. One of them that you've flagged is our ability to construct infrastructure needed to support growing electricity demand. And that I would assume, could be anything from EV charging infrastructure to transmission lines to solar farms.
Well, I think this is really huge, right? For Canada, one of the really important paths to reducing emissions is electrification. So that means, using electricity in areas of the economy that perhaps it hasn't been used before, whether it's transportation, home heating, industrial processes, and the like. And that could mean, a really massive scaling up of our electricity generating capacity in the country. Some estimates talk about a 2 to 3 times scale up of generation capacity. That, Markham, is a huge amount of infrastructure that's going to need to be built, whether it's new nuclear, hydro, solar, wind, you name it. And then the question becomes, will we be able to get all of this stuff permitted, financed, accepted by communities at the sort of rate that we will need to have that happen in the years ahead when it comes to electrification? And I think that's an area where, we haven't necessarily put our minds to that as much as we need to. We have a lot of models that say, yes, we'll increase electricity use. Okay, but how? How are we actually going to do that in the real worlds of regulatory frameworks, politics, community support, financing, and the like?
I want to provide just one concrete example of that, Monica. I'm getting ready to publish an essay on BC's electricity system asking that very question, because there are estimates that BC will need double its electricity by 2050. So that's currently they have 32 hydro dams that produce the bulk of 18,000 roughly megawatts of generating capacity. So if you double that, can you then go out and build 32 more hydro dams? Well, they're not going to build one more hydro dam. So where is all that electricity going to come from? And and nobody's asking the question. And you could take that example and ask the same thing in Ontario, in Saskatchewan, in the Maritimes. We're simply not addressing it.
Oh, I think that's exactly right. I mean, if you look at, and again, back to this concept of energy security, if you look at the International Energy Agency's definition of energy security, it's, having energy sources available and having them be affordable. And, we've put a lot of our focus, I think, on sources, right? So there's a lot of work that's done around what are our energy systems going to look like in the future in terms of proportion of electrification, how much fossil fuel use, all of these things, but a lot less attention to how are we going to make sure that those sources are available and that they're affordable. And that's something that we haven't seen as much as we need to see. And again, Markham, I'm an optimist. You know that about me. I think we're beginning to see, situations like Texas, I think, are a real wake-up call. And again, I want to underscore there, the issue in Texas was not about renewables. It wasn't the fault, quote unquote, of renewables, but planning a system without adequate attention to reliability. This is what can happen. And we've seen, the devastating impacts of that. And it's even led to political calls mobilizing that situation to actually try to roll back or reduce climate action, which I think, again, regardless of the cause of a blackout, we may begin to see those sorts of things happen. And then it's one step forward and two steps back. So you really need that integrated approach going forward that, yes, talks about the sources, but also talks about how we're going to make sure that they're available, how we're going to make sure that they're affordable.
I'm glad you brought up the example of Texas and the US scenario in general, because there's a very big difference between the United States and Canada constitutionally. I mean, in Canada, the provinces are responsible for natural resources, which includes electricity. And essentially, that means that the Canadian energy regulator and the federal government have very little influence over these kinds of questions, unless, it's like transmission lines crossing a border. Whereas in the US, you've got the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and you have more federal authority to advance these kinds of discussions and address issues like Texas. And so what happens in Canada is we tend to be siloed. It's every province having its own discussion about electricity, and we don't have a national discussion that sort of knits together all of these concerns and issues and how to address them.
Yeah, I mean, I think, first I'd push back a little bit, Markham, on the notion that in the US it's federally driven. I think there's definitely a lot of powers that are at the state level as well, in terms of renewable portfolio standards, climate policy. I mean, Texas, one of the reasons, it has its own siloed grid, and that was one of the weaknesses, frankly, that was demonstrated by that blackout. But again, leaving that part aside, I agree with you that in Canada, we have had and will, I suspect in many ways, continue to have siloed systems in terms of the regulatory frameworks. And a lot of if you're talking electricity, a lot of our systems, Markham, were built, and I'm talking here about generation capacity and transmission infrastructure, were built to sell into US markets, right? So they're north, south predominantly systems. Many of them were overbuilt, frankly, to be able to take advantage of export opportunities. And so we haven't necessarily had that east-west collaboration the way that, frankly, we're going to need it going forward. And I think, here's an opportunity too, again, to be positive, where that laboratory of federalism, as it's often referred to, could be a really useful opportunity to see, okay, what is British Columbia doing, for example, to advance these issues? How could that be useful in other jurisdictions? What's Ontario doing? How could that be useful in Atlantic Canada and the like? But there's no question in my mind, and this is where I would agree with you, that we're going to need a lot more collaboration, not only across the country, but also within the system, between different segments of the system, the policy parts, the regulatory parts, the industry parts, the community parts and the like.
Just to clarify, my point was that there was more federal authority in the US, not that the states didn't have any authority and it was mostly federal. Just a point of clarification.
Always fun to disagree just a bit, though.
As we do, as we often do. So let's talk about what Canada should do. And you've got 3 points here. So I'll let you explain them, please.
Yeah, no, I should think, first and foremost to my mind is we've got the sources piece, right? There's a lot of focus of decision makers, notably policymakers, on the energy sources piece. A lot of modeling done around what Canada's energy system is going to look like in the future. It's bringing that availability side, which certainly for electricity is very much about reliability, and bringing the pricing side, ensuring that we've got affordability, because we know there are ample examples of Canadians pushing back hard on price increases, across any energy source. So it's bringing that affordability and availability side alongside the sources piece, notably for when we're talking about emissions reductions decision making. So that's sort of job number one. The second thing we need to do is we really need to connect up the world of those who are doing the sort of planning and modeling of our energy systems, and often that's in the sort of climate world, with those in the real worlds of energy decision making. And that's, the regulators, the industry at the community level, thinking through how are we going to make sure all of this moves forward in an integrated way, and bringing to bear, all of the imperatives that we're going to need to make align in order to make this work. And then the third piece, again, which builds on the second point I just made, is really about collaboration, right? There's no, to your point earlier, there's no single jurisdiction, there's no single entity that can like make all of this work on its own. It's going to take collaboration, bringing together all the players who have the authority, the expertise, the infrastructure, the know-how to be able to make us move forward on emissions reductions in a way that will also pay attention to energy security.
I want to make a point on that, on your last, your third point about collaboration. There's a trend worldwide in electricity systems to go from a vertically integrated market that is, kind of siloed from other systems to a flat horizontal model where the utility essentially becomes like a platform for buyers and sellers, people generating their own electricity from the rooftop or from their own, industry or whatever. And what that means is then you have more people participating in the electricity system all the time. And that suggests that there needs to be more input and more collaboration from all of these new players who are participating in a way they didn't do under the old industrial model.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, my view is that we are in a period of unprecedented experimentation around our energy systems, and electricity would be no exception there. And, but it raises a whole host of issues, right? So how to make sure that if you've got folks who are, jumping off of the grid, so to speak, in terms of becoming those prosumers that we talk about, generating their own electricity, how do we make sure that we still have the capacity and the generation capacity for the broader system, and that we're not leaving the sort of costs of that infrastructure on the backs of those maybe who are least or less able to afford it, right? The so-called utility death spiral in terms of, who's going to pay for all these capital costs. I think, likewise, when it comes to regulators, we have regulatory frameworks, particularly in the utility system, that are on, this so-called regulatory compact that basically are about cost of service regulation. How do you make sure that utilities can get the rate of return they need for the capital that they've invested? Those frameworks don't necessarily take into consideration, and in many instances don't at all take into consideration, environmental benefits. Right, so you've got both regulators and utilities and other folks in the sector who are saying, wait a minute, we're delivering environmental benefits in terms of emissions reductions. How can we make sure that regulators who are permitting projects can actually take that into consideration? So there's a whole host, to your point, Markham, we've got to bring everybody together, all the various players, and work out what is the new sort of decision-making arrangements that we need to be able to continue to move forward on emissions reductions, but in a way that delivers on energy sources, availability, and affordability.
Well, let's wrap up this conversation, Monica, with a need. I'll flag this because I know we agree on it, and that is the need for a national conversation about these kinds of issues. We need, from BC to the Maritimes, we need players to start talking to each other, whether those are governments or industry or whoever they are, but we need to have a national conversation to flag the important issues and talk about how we're going to solve those going forward. And we don't have a lot of time to get it started.
Oh, I couldn't agree with you more. And I think, one of the perhaps challenges here is that this stuff, it is pretty complex, thinking through how all of these things fit together. I mean, I've been researching and studying energy for decades, and it takes a lot of time to sort of sort through what the issues are. And that, doesn't make for really, how shall I say, really quick and easy to digest sound bites, notably for politicians and for political leaders. And so it's how do you, kind of get this on the agenda in a way where not only do political leaders and decision makers see the relevance of these issues, but they're willing to dedicate some political capital to actually addressing them. Because there's no question to my mind that folks in the regulatory space, a lot of people in the industry space, in the civil society space, they see these issues, they see a need for it. It's really getting it onto that agenda and making sure that, and I would say it's not just about a national conversation, it's also regional conversations as well, because many of our energy systems, electricity for sure, are regional markets.
Monica, thank you very much for this. Always appreciate your insights.
Happy to be here. Thanks, Markham.